Hello and welcome to the Indo-German Business Talk. The Indo-German Business Talk is the monthly format at the Indo-German Centre for Business Excellence, where every month we talk about a different topic that is pertinent to Indo-German business relations. And our topic today will be climate resilient food systems. So two important topics: food and agriculture and climate change. As usual, I am joined by a group of experts, and we will have a conversation here about this topic. In a moment, I will also introduce them to you, obviously, but for those who are regular listeners and viewers of our webinar, we also always try to bring you, the audience, into the conversation by asking a few questions so that you can answer, and by also giving you the opportunity to ask questions to us, to the panelists. And we do that using a service called Slido, slido.com. And actually, I have a first question to you that you can answer while I will introduce our panelists. And the question is, what does climate resilient food systems mean to you? So this is an open question. You can just type in one or maybe also more words that you associate with that term, and we will then later see a so-called word cloud, so we will be able to see what all of you came up with. So please go to the Slido page now, start inputting your thoughts into the system, and we will look at the results in a moment. While you do that, I will introduce our panelists, and we have 4 of them here today, and I will introduce them in no particular order, so just random order, beginning with Roberto Villalba. Roberto is a doctoral candidate and research associate at the Technical University of Munich, and he is deeply engaged in the quest for enhanced financial inclusion of smallhold farmers in the global south. His research focuses on the role of digital technology, value chains, and climate change in this financial inclusion topic. And he brings a wealth of hands-on experience from his work on agricultural development projects in Latin America and South Asia. Welcome, Roberto.
Thank you very much, Matthias.
Next, we have Nandini Agarwal. She is a program associate at the Council on Energy, Environment in Water, based in India, in Delhi. And Nandini focuses her research on amplifying regenerative and sustainable agriculture in India. She's a recipient of the prestigious German Chancellor Fellowship, and she will soon be studying successful food policy councils in Germany. So that's excellent. She has a strong foundation in urban and peri-urban foodscapes and environmental policy, and she aims to translate her learnings into policy and community interventions in India. Nandini, welcome to this session.
Thanks a lot. Pleasure to be here.
Next, we have Francesco Ajena, who is a technical specialist at IFAD with a specialization in agroecology. And his vast experience spans roles as a consultant for the FAO, a policy advisor for IPES Food, and a policy advisor for the Belgian Green Party. So pretty broad CV here. He's an alumnus of the Université Libre de Bruxelles and the Universidad de Pinar del Rio in Cuba. Francesco's expertise lies in translating research into effective agroecological policies. Francesco, welcome also to you to the session.
Thanks for having me.
And then finally, we have Shilanjani Bhattacharyya, and she is currently a joint doctoral researcher at the Frobenius Institute, which is located at Goethe University in Frankfurt, same city where we are located, and also at the University of Groningen, I think that's the proper way of pronouncing it, which is in the Netherlands. She has made some significant contributions to India's National Nutrition Mission, and her current research uncovers the socio-cultural dynamics of the resurgence of millet cereals in Odisha, India. And she examines how millets are becoming agents of cultural change among tribal communities, particularly in relation to social organization, labor relations, and religious practices. So also quite interesting. As you can see, we have a very diverse panel looking at the topic from different angles, and this is obviously how it should be. Now, let's hope that the audience, you guys have been active in the meantime, inputting your thoughts into our word cloud. And this is what we have so far. So we have different terms here, a lot of large sentences or large kind of fragments, low GHG emissions. I'm going to be honest, I don't know exactly what GHG stands for, but we'll find out. I suppose that one of our experts can shed some light on that. Technologies that save water and resources, water conservation. So we're straight into climate change issues here, I guess. Carbon footprint is mentioned, climate smart agriculture, sustainable, inclusive food production with no environmental harm. Interesting, or maybe probably at least as minimal as possible. And again, related to what was said further up there, water conservation, weather-resistant farming. Okay, very interesting. Thank you very much for your contributions so far. Let's move into the topic. And let's begin actually with a topic that is not directly or only related to climate change, but I think it's very important when we talk about food security, and that is urbanization and population growth, which of course, the two things that are happening in India right now. Roberto, you are an expert on smallhold farmers, as we have said. How do you see India's rapid urbanization and growing population? How does that, in your experience, affect rural livelihoods and the situation of smallhold farmers?
Well, thank you, Matthias. I think it's not only a dynamic that is happening in India, but of course, there's a lot of smallholder farmers, and even in India, quite important is the concept of the marginal farmers, who are those that have less than 1 hectare, and this could be up to 80% of the population of the farmers in India. And it's quite important because a lot of them don't have enough incentives or enough opportunities to stay in the farm, and they prefer to move to the cities, and thus also poses significant risks in terms of food security, because the next generations are having less, well, there will be less producers, let's say, in the next generations. So of course, this is a challenge, and I think, I mean, also with other challenges such as climate change is posing barriers. And that's why also I think it's important that there's a new generation of researchers, I think, that are also getting quite interested into this topic. Maybe some decades ago, most of the focus was on how to increase productivity, which is of course important, but other points such as the social part, the immigration part, or climate change were completely overlooked. And I think it's a very good way to kick off the conversation right now.
Nandini, given your work, how do you see urbanization in India? Is that just a challenge, or is it maybe also an opportunity when it comes to food security?
Well, that's an interesting question, actually. And Roberto was pretty pointed to say that there's a lot of migration happening also away from agriculture into more perhaps menial daily wage oriented jobs for people who at the end of the day do come to cities for something that might not even economically sustain them in the long run, for example. It's interesting that you would also frame it as an opportunity. Currently, I mean, in the latest budget, for example, the government of India has come up with a scheme where they want to, it's called the Agriculture Accelerator Fund, essentially, where they want to promote young entrepreneurs from rural India in agri-tech. And essentially what the opportunity there would stand for is that you start skilling people in the current requirements for someone in the audience that said climate smart agriculture. So what are the kind of technologies that are needed for us to come back to the field that at the same time allow farmers to sustain their livelihoods in a way that is supported by political, social, economic infrastructure. So the opportunity for urbanization would be the right kind of skilling, but I don't essentially think it's really linked to urbanization also. The idea is to understand how can you how can you still support reverse migration for people and create the set of opportunities that still allow them to sustain economically and socially, and actually remove pressure from urban centers that's increasingly in Delhi, for example, we're a city of 20 million plus. How much more can the city really take? And how much more the urban centers of the world can really take. So what urbanization as an opportunity could be linked to is the right kind of skill development to essentially come back to the fields and allow people to sustain themselves with the right technologies at hand.
Okay, so what you're saying is, rather than see urbanization as a given, yeah, as just a natural fact that can't be stopped, you say we need to look at ways in which to maybe slow down the degree of urbanization, or also to a certain extent reverse it by giving people incentives to go back to the rural areas where they originally came from?
That's right. And if I may just use another 30 seconds, 2 minutes to classify that a little bit more. Just 2 months ago or so, my team and I were in Andhra Pradesh talking to a few people in a district to really understand what challenges the communities are facing right now and whether or not they are even interested in farming at all anymore. And we've all been through the COVID stress recently internationally. And it was really COVID that made a lot of people come back to the farms. And what we heard in those focus group discussions was also that, well, now that we're here, we want to stay here. And why don't you people create some right kind of economic opportunities for us so that we can sustain ourselves here? So it's important for us to also understand what the feelings and the emotions of people across the board are and where the gap needs to be filled. And here we can also start thinking about building local economic structures that talk about production and consumption loops within the rural areas itself. So that's one example where I think reverse migration is really an opportunity for us as well.
Shilanjani, you look at these things not just from a kind of a agronomy perspective, but also from a cultural and even religious, as we have heard in the introduction. What roles can these approaches play when it comes to convincing people that it might be good to stay in rural areas or even to migrate back from urban centers?
Well, in my experience, food systems or cereals that are traditionally grown in these rural areas in marginal contexts are not just important for food security, but also important in terms of cultural identity, because life worlds of people center around these crops in a way. And it is a practice for almost the entire village or almost the entire population of a certain region to return during times of rituals or festivals. And these festivals are not just moments of celebration, but also of exchange, of generating income. And I think this is something that is also being taken up by policies such as the Orissa Millet Mission, who are trying to strengthen the local ecosystems, the local livelihoods. And I think that is a very valuable contribution, especially because people are moving away from their traditional modes of cultivation, their traditional practices, because of lack of opportunities, lack of economic opportunities. And that is something that if policymakers contribute to, as is happening increasingly now, could be a good opportunity to address this question of reverse migration. Yeah.
You mentioned millets, and some of our viewers may or may not know that we're actually in the Year of the Millet, the UN Year of the Millet. It's a very versatile crop. A few weeks ago, we had a millet week here at our university, where we were presented with different types of dishes, all made from or with millets. And we learned that it's a much more versatile food or crop than maybe many of us thought. So that's quite interesting. And the Shilanjani, correct me if I'm wrong, but the interesting thing is that it's both a very traditional crop that has had a very high importance in India, but it also happens to be a quite resilient crop in terms of adaptation to adverse climatic circumstances. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. It is very well adapted to local to local climates, and it is a climate resilient crop because it requires very minimal inputs of water or fertilizers, and it can grow also in drought-like conditions. So even when there is less rainfall, which is increasingly happening in certain regions because of climate change, it is still suited to grow and to flourish and to, of course, then contribute to questions of food security and food sovereignty, perhaps.
Francesco, you're with IFAD, and obviously you look at these issues globally for many countries. Climate change is something that affects all of us, and predominantly, of course, countries in the so-called global south. Now, what role, in your opinion, do the focus on different types of crop play? This idea that we might have to change the way we do agriculture, may have to switch to other types of crops, maybe crops that were traditionally used more and now will have some sort of a comeback, but also maybe new variants, modified crops. What role does that play in your work and also in your experience across the global south?
Yeah, I mean, looking for adapted crop varieties is absolutely essential for building resilience in many contexts. I mean, the millet is a good example of how we could look at different type of crops, especially for starchy foods, to sustain food security and rightly, as Shilanjani has rightly said, also food sovereignty. Although I mean, it is more like I mean, it is important to look at the question of resilience from a systemic perspective, meaning crops is the variety of crops are one thing, but then we also need to build the resilience around everything that kind of sustains the crops and crop production, including irrigation, including diversification, including different types of agricultural techniques, and which also requires technical assistance and also political support. Regarding the type of crops, what I think is also essential is to look at the question of seeds, which is, of course, when looking at adapted crop varieties, is one of the main issue. As we know, in the world, and I think it is the same also for India, the majority of seeds are coming from what we call the peasant seed systems, which is kind of opposed to the certified systems. In Europe, we have after some years of debate, removed the catalog. So now it is possible for farmers to breed their own seeds and to get to the varieties they need, and also to commercialize those varieties. In many parts of the world, that's not the case. There is still a kind of polarized debate between the certified system seed systems and the so-called peasant seed systems. Which is an important debate to have. What we are trying to do with IFAD in the different programs, and especially one that I'm coordinating in Africa and Latin America, is to look at the seed systems and to work together with the research institutes and certification institutes to look at how we can actually ensure that the quality of seeds is the good one. And that also we can support the kind of breeding techniques that can help us to build resilience. We are working especially on what we call the evolutionary plant breeding, which is a technique which pertain more or less to the area of agroecology, and also to population breeding and participatory plant breeding. We think that these are opportunities that are much more promising in terms of building resilience of crops compared to very expensive and possibly also controversial as you mentioned, GM GM crops, so genetic modified crops, and including everything that is in between, including CRISPs and CRISPR and the more recent techniques that have been developed. These are very expensive and inaccessible for most of the farmers. They might be interesting in some cases. I'm personally not very interested on that, because I mean, I've been researching quite a lot, but that's what I always say. It can be interesting to a certain extent, but I think we do have, in terms of competitive advantages, we do have lots of better alternatives that are much more accessible, that are much more interesting in terms of investments, and especially for the so-called global south.
Maybe highlight some of them. What would your suggestion be? Which areas should we focus on?
In terms of breedings, or in terms of in general of building agricultural resilience?
Yeah, both, I guess.
Okay, so in terms of breedings, what we are focusing on is especially evolutionary plant breeding, meaning that we are trying to introduce, instead of building on one specific, focusing on one specific genetic sequence, in terms of like trying to reach a sort of a stability in terms of the genetic sequence in the field, which is usually done when we certify. We certify some kind of varieties. We try to actually use functional biodiversity and functional diversity in genetic in the sense of genetic. For example, on corn, it is well known, and there is quite some research. But just to take one example on what is called maïs population in French, which is I think it can be translated as evolutionary plant breeding in English, meaning that it is a method to have like we have different varieties in a crop that we are mixing with free pollination, and we are trying to keep that sort of genetic diversity that not only builds much more resilience, because we know that genetic diversity helps to increase resilience, because some specific variety might be more sensitive than another to different types of stressors and shocks, including climatic, but also pests and so forth. But also it kind of ensures that the productivity, the yields are constant in the time, because we know that, for example, in the case of corn, we have a degrees of productivity with the let's say the classic seeds varieties that we use over time. So we have to renew and to buy again, which is also very important. I think in the case of India, it has been in the center of the debate quite a lot. Also, sadly, the question of debts and farmer debts. So actually building resilience in terms of ability to produce and to have good quality seeds that are also resilient to different shocks and stressors, also kind of release the need to buy and buy again. These seeds are often certified seeds, and hybrid seeds are often inaccessible for most of the farmers. They are too expensive. Okay. So yeah. That's one thing. And yeah, regarding, sorry, very briefly, other types of techniques that are needed to build resilience is definitely the agroecology, let's say in general, to be brief, as a group of practices of soil and water conservation, for example, and also functional biodiversity that can have to build resilience in the farm. So the techniques part, but lots of things are needed. Adapted irrigation, also access to credit. It's absolutely important, and yeah, but I'll be too long, so I have to stop here.
Yeah, no, this is excellent, and as we can see, there are many angles through which we can look at this issue. I would actually like to bring in the audience one more time with another question, and this time it's a multiple choice question where you can choose from a list. And the question is, what is our biggest motivator to achieving climate smart agriculture? And you have 4 options that you should be able to see on the Slido screen. So kindly press the button what you think is the biggest motivator. Maybe there are more than one. Choose the one that you believe is the most important one. In the meantime, maybe let's go back to our panelists. We'll look at the screen in a moment. Nandini, you will, as I mentioned in the introduction, soon be coming to Germany to study some of the agricultural policies here in Germany. What do you think can maybe India learn from Germany, but also the other way around? What can Germany learn from India when it comes to agriculture, when it comes to climate resilient food systems?
That's a very interesting question about what knowledge can we really exchange and what really is applicable in a different socio-political context, really, and to be very careful about what we want to replicate versus what we want to learn from. And essentially, that's the idea for me when to come to Germany, while my research itself will focus on the governance of food policy councils. These are as some of you may already be aware, for those who are not, I'll just tell you a little bit about what it is. These are essentially institutions that started off somewhere in the 70s and 80s in the US, where one of the towns, and it was a complicated name, so please excuse me because I don't remember the name, but they were trying to overcome the impact of recession on the local food supply chain. And essentially, entrepreneurs, consumers, producers at that time decided to come together to solve the problem of food unavailability for many at that time. And they were really focusing on the challenge of food insecurity as opposed to more advanced and evolved topics of nutritional security that we are usually talking about these days. And food policy councils were essentially structures that it was conceptualized and stemmed at that time because it allowed people to bridge gaps of what current market structures allow us to do and inherently solve the problem of food unavailability for many in that city at that point. So food policy councils since then have kind of emerged across the states and many parts of Europe, as well as Brazil and South Africa. And in my knowledge till now, I know a few in the city of Freiburg. There's one in the city of Freiburg, for example. There's one in Kassel, one in Berlin. And all of these institutions, all of these food policy councils are essentially trying to solve very contextual problems for the city. Essentially, they're trying to complement the global food supply chains and fill in the gaps by making local structures that allow food systems to be resilient in times of need. And always, we've seen very current examples again with how things kind of came up in different countries in COVID and how these local supply chains allow us to be resilient in that sense. So by really understanding what are the motivations of food policy councils, why people are even participating in them, what are some of the successes of them. I know from the city of Freiburg, for example, that because of the food policy council, the mayor has now passed a scheme where 30% of all food that goes to the hospitals and schools will be locally and sustainably produced. I would love to hear from someone who also does know more about it. I will only do my research next year. But the idea is to really understand what process learnings can we learn and then apply in India. Will food policy councils even make sense in India? What form and shape will they take, given that we have a much larger rural socio-economic problem to solve for, and it's not just urban. So this is essentially what I hope to learn next year.
Okay, Roberto, you've worked a lot with smallhold farmers in South Asia. Is that something that is helpful, these councils? Is that an idea that you've come across as well?
I think there are like different stages that are need to be considered here. One of them is, for instance, councils or like all the organizations that farmers can have at the farm level, at the smallholder level. So, for instance, Shilanjani also mentioned that the cultural part is quite important. But I think another point here that is very relevant when we talk, for instance, about climate resilience food systems is that usually we focus a lot on smallholder farmers. But the truth is that the farmers are one actor within a lot of very different actors, like within the value chain or within a whole food system. So if we just consider the farmers, we're doing something very important, but maybe we are not giving enough incentives to the whole chain or the whole set of actors to really be more climate resilient, for instance. So what we found in some research actually in India with some companies that are working, working in financial inclusion with farmers, is that the best way to really develop this more sustainable and resilient financial systems is to work with the whole ecosystem. In this case, the ecosystem refers to the farmers, but also to the processors in the area, to the people who work delivering services, financial services, advisors, agribusinesses, and so on. And only when you really can develop a financial model from within, like a sort of business model, only then these business models can be sustainable. Otherwise, what we also see not only in India, but in many different countries, especially in developing countries, is that developing organizations or research institutions even can come up with financial products or financial instruments, but in the end, they are not very well fitted to the needs of the farmers or to the needs of the other actors. But then the project runs out of funds after 4 or 5 years, and then the project stops there, and this climate resilient systems don't work anymore. So I think this is also something very important to consider, and not only to think about sustainability in terms of the environmental sense of the word, but also in considering the financial part. That's actually what I do a bit of my research in, how to consider the needs of all the actors, farmers inclusive, of course, but all the other actors as well, so these systems can be more resilient.
I understand you correctly that maybe the reason why some attempts or some policies fail is that they always tend to look at one particular subset. So they either look at, you know, the types of crops, or they look at financial incentives, or they look at cultural things and stuff like that. But there is too little holistic approaches to the whole topic.
That's part of it. I mean, I think there's a lot of initiatives already doing this, but I think the main point is when there is also an incentive for the private sector. And I think actually India is doing that quite well, especially in the part of agri-tech. I think is the main hub worldwide where there's a lot of companies. I just read the other day, there's more than 1,000 startups already working in agri-tech from around 7 years ago. So there's a big boom, and they're working in different areas. So they could be delivering services about mechanization, or they can just develop an app to help farmers to give them some production advice. Or there's also agri-fintechs, for instance, that try to deliver this financial services so farmers can ideally look on the phone and look for good credit options that are well fitted for them. And then also important is in here, if I just talk briefly about this technology part, as I said, India is doing very well here, but it's also quite important to consider all the offline or in-person contact that this services, how these services can be translated into agriculture. And that maybe also brings back the discussion about the urban and rural discussion, because a lot of these apps or services are designed by people who work and live in the cities and try to deliver services to the farmers. But then what we also realize in our research is that when these companies have both a digital or an online platform, but also an offline service or facility where farmers can really reach out to the advisors, then they are efficient. But when they only go for one or the other, it's not that resilient in the end. So I think keeping also this in mind, it's very important, especially in the case of India.
I want to go briefly back to our question and see if we have a final verdict. There it is. And I think that's clear. So in terms of our audience, at least, the biggest motivator is indeed the climate crisis, much more so than the growing urban population or global population and the empowerment issues. But as we have, I think, also found out from the conversation so far, it's really hard to disentangle these four issues. They're all in one way or another connected. I would like to go to Shilanjani. We've heard that on the one hand, we want to, or you also want to give rural populations in India the possibility to sustain their traditional lifestyle. You said that it's not just about the technical stuff. It's also about a way of life, about celebrating community life, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, we've also heard that these things might have to change. We will have to make use of technology. We may have to switch the types of crops that we use because some of them may not be possible to grow anymore under different climate conditions. How does that work? And also in your experience, how can you balance these two seemingly opposed objectives?
Right. I think the relevance of the local communities, especially in the context of cultivation of neglected crops such as millets, will always be significant, because that is where these crops grow mostly. These are the communities who have continued to grow millets, even when there was the growing effects of the Green Revolution, which brought rice and wheat and replaced millets also largely. And these are the communities who will have to be strengthened if we want to bring back millets, and rather add millets to our plates also for the urban populations. Having said that, I would like to reflect on perhaps certain changes that are happening in these communities where technological advancements or technological interventions are coming in. For example, as Roberto very rightly said, we need to focus on the entire value chain and not just on one part of the process. And this brings me to think that processing of the cereals is something that really needs a lot of focus. And that is where the new policy interventions are also working, because that is where most of the drudgery happens, especially for the women who work with it. To protect and to sustain certain crops, certain seeds from being on the decline, we have to eat them. Consumption is important for continuation of cultivation. So, and for that, processing is really important, especially at the local level, and for which entrepreneurship, local entrepreneurship, is something that policymakers have been thinking about, strengthening local communities to form collectives to organize transactions, market transactions, as well as bringing in machines that not just replace traditional techniques, but also just go hand in hand. Right? So these are some of the things we can think about. But of course, the focus on the rural populations is extremely important, because they are most of the producers, and they are the ones that will sort of bring forth the millets to the rest of the world, perhaps. Yeah.
I have an excellent follow-up question from our audience, actually, on that. And by the way, I would like to encourage everyone else, if you have questions to our panelists, please use Slido to submit them through the chat function, and we will then put them to our group of experts. And we have a question from Pranju Gupta that is about millets, and I'm going to read it to you. Millets are expensive compared with not so climate-friendly and less healthy crops like rice, primarily due to consumer behavior. So that alludes to what you just said, Shilanjani. How to turn that around? What would your answer be? Maybe Shilanjani, and then I'll let others weigh in as well.
Right. At this moment, the government is, I think, prioritizing making millets more profitable for rural communities. The prices of millets still, I think, 2 to 3 years back, before the Orissa Millet Mission and various other government policies started their work, was around 18 or even lesser, 15 rupees per kg. But now, because of the work of the government, it is almost 35 to 37 rupees. So right now, the focus is really on making these communities empowered to cultivate more millets. And I think another reason why the prices of these millet foods or millet products is more, perhaps, is because of the kind of packaged foods that millets are being converted into. There is not much of a focus on the kind of traditional foods that millets, the traditional ways in which millets are consumed by the communities from where they originate. Rather, the focus is more on converting millets to suit urban populations, for example, in terms of like noodles or biscuits or cookies or something like that, which I guess takes away much of the focus. But if we look at the ways in which millets are consumed by the local population, which is perhaps more nutritious, is in the form of a gruel, like a soup, or in the form of like a lentils or a curry. So I think the focus should be away from really trying to adapt millets to the urban populations, but rather in, taking inspiration from the ways people have been traditionally consuming millets. And that is a larger conversation, of course, but perhaps something to think about.
Francesco, maybe from your perspective, is that something like working on pricing to incentivize farmers to switch maybe from the production of one type of crop to another one? Is that something that works, or is it more like Shilanjani has said, trying to incentivize different dietary habits? What works best there in your experience across different countries?
Well, I think we have to do both. The approach that we are kind of supporting is more like integrated and systemic approaches, where we look also, as Roberto said, we try to look at the whole, and also Nandini was talking about that. It also relates to the Food Policy Council's kind of approach. No, it's like putting together different parts of food systems and entry points and try to work on. The question can be deconstructed. No, what makes a price higher than another? What is determining the price? Of course, is the balance between the offer and the demand, but is also all the costs that are related to that. No, the cost of inputs, the cost of transport, the access to market, and so on and so forth. So it's in what is important is to work on. I mean, depending also on the different levels of structures that the farmers that would need support are into. What is definitely important is that the price and the profit for them. I mean, that they are in a profitable farming business, because farming is a business. So they need to make a profit out of that. There are different ways. Either if you want to increase your profit, of course, either you can increase the price because you have demand that is justifying the increase of price. So your product, the marginal cost will be justified, or you can also try to reduce your production cost, and this is what has been successfully done with the zero budget natural farming in Andhra Pradesh, which is I think a world-class example of how you would introduce a kind of resilient and agroecological practices, and how you can actually make profits for farmers more interesting, but while also keeping the price for consumers fair, and to keep on having accessible diets, or making diets even more accessible, is to reduce the production cost, which includes the seeds, as I mentioned, but also the fertilizers. We know that fertilizers have been up, and they're skyrocketing now, even more, unfortunately, with the situation in Ukraine. And also the speculation on the oil markets. So we know that all of that is actually being extremely depending for inputs is very risky for farmers. It's a problem for their resilience, but it's also what would impact then the market in terms of pricing. Of course, if to produce 1 kilo of rice, I have to spend a lot for fertilizer, for pesticides, for seeds, and I have to buy every year hybrid seeds that are extremely costly, then the price would need to be justified. What is also which has problems, because so what we are trying to support in the kind of work that we are doing is we do want, which is different now from in organic agriculture, we have introduced a long time ago the idea that you have a differentiated quality. You have a higher quality for certain products because you don't have pesticides residues, because you have because they're more tasty, because they are more healthy. So the higher price is justified. But this is somehow wrong. I think that's my personal opinion, because the reason why conventional food is cheap is because it's highly subsidized, and that's, I think, also the case in India. So actually producing conventional food is much more expensive than producing natural or agroecological food. The way why it's cheaper is because we could make economies of scales with larger scales farming operations, and then also received by supported by specific socio-technical regimes, including policy and subsidies that are kind of making production costs to decrease the production cost and then to be able to sell at a lower price. I think that's also one important part of the picture, is how do we look also at the sort of interferences of subsidies into the market.
Okay, that's interesting. And sometimes, things may appear cheap, but if you look at them more closely, maybe they're not that cheap. Anyway, you mentioned economies of scale, and this is something I would want to address briefly in this session. For now, we talked a lot about smallholder farmers. We talked a lot about a production that is close to the locus of consumption. Now, obviously, agriculture, the food market is also a global market. Many crops that we've been discussing here, they have a world market price. And we have all seen, for example, when the war in Ukraine started, Ukraine being a large agricultural producer, exporter, that had very, very direct consequences on the world market price for a lot of different types of agricultural products, with the effect of exacerbating food shortages in other parts of the world, such as, for example, Africa. Now, my question to you would be, to what extent is what we've been discussing, the smallholder farming, is that even possible to contribute meaningfully to the overall amount of food production that we need in the world? Or do we need the kind of the big, large-scale, massive, globalized food production as well to generate the sheer amounts of crop, for example, output that we need? Maybe, Roberto, what is your take? You work with smallholders, but is it, or on smallholder farmers, but is that a complement, or can it really be like a significant percentage of the global food production?
Well, that's a very complicated question to answer.
Okay, sorry, maybe try to
I'm
simplify
not saying
it.
because I'm not working there. I'm definitely working there. It's just it's very complex, and it's one of the main ongoing discussions, for instance, in the field of agricultural economics or agriculture in general in the last 10 years at least. So one of the key questions is really, can really smallholders feed the world? And that's also something, there's a lot of research going on in this way, but I think the key part is that both systems are have both good things to improve as well. So for instance, from the big farming perspective, I think we definitely also need part of that. It's not the best in terms of sustainability necessarily, but also it brings food to people who need it. And we also shouldn't always romanticize the role of the smallholder farmers. Yes, they are very important. They also have as Shilanjani mentioned, the cultural aspect is very important for farming as well. But it doesn't need that it needs to always be kept so small or so romanticized, as I said, in this way. And at the same time, it needs improvements. As I said, one of the parts, for instance, financial parts, and we just compared this, big farmers and small farmers are playing a completely uneven field. Big farmers have way better opportunities to also produce the way they do. They have better access to loans, they have more land, they have better machinery. So it's very easy to say maybe those smallholders farmers are not competitive, but they don't have the same conditions. But sometimes it's even out of their hands. In the case of India, is also a very good example. Farms are very small by nature, and usually they are divided with the next generation. That means that if a family has 10 hectares, the next generation will split the farm and will get half between two brothers or even less. And that's also not the worst case. Like 10 hectares is already good for India, but usually, as I said before, a lot of the farmers have 2 or 1 hectare or less. So that then also the part of the topic of how competitive the farmers can be is also quite important. But I think there is a lot of nuances and different points that need to be addressed. So I wouldn't really go with saying this way can be done for just big farmers or just smallholder farmers. I think both sectors have to be balanced, and together they can feed the world.
I see some nodding among our panelists. So I guess you agree. Not romanticizing things. I think that sounds sensible to me, because that is also something, especially when you look at developed countries, while a lot of the food that we produce or that we consume is kind of from large scale agricultural operations, still the way it's marketed. If you go to the supermarket and you look at the packaging, it's still romanticized in a way that there are, nice cows and nice landscape, and everything looks like it's kind of from a romantic notion of agriculture that may actually not be the case. And of course, we also know that you've mentioned that smallholder farming may not be so romantic because it's also a lot of hardship, very, very difficult economic conditions that a lot of these farmers work in. We're already slowly coming to the end. So what I would like to do is give all of you the opportunity for one final round. And what I would like you to focus on is, in your view, what is the biggest obstacle when it comes to having really holistic, working, climate resilient food systems? What would you say is the most important issue that we need to tackle there? And I would like to begin with Nandini.
Thank you. That's again a very big question, and I think I don't know if I'll be able to do justice in the next minute or two. But I guess one thing that we should definitely focus on, and something that all of us have briefly touched upon about it, is that we should take a systemic approach. Only when, like, for example, Francesco spoke about very deep technology of the crop itself, but resilience on the farm means resilience of the crop, which means the kinds of crops that we're growing on the farm, which includes, for example, crops like hardy crops such as millets, but also the cropping practices. Can we think of diversity of cropping practices, which actually enhances diversity in the soil and enhances resilience for the farm itself? So that is one way to look at resilience on the farm itself, but it's also, to support that resilience, it's also very important to ensure both resilience of market linkages and market structures, as well as consumption itself. So by resilience and market linkages, it essentially means not just relying on one source of markets. It's not just supermarkets that can feed the world, and it's not also just public distribution systems that can feed large populations of the country. Essentially, a mix of diverse market linkages that farmers have access to be able to sell locally and to be able to sell at beyond borders, perhaps not just regionally but also internationally, but also access for consumers to those different marketplaces, which essentially means affordability, availability, and access to food. So resilience for food system essentially needs to solve for all layers of resilience of a system. And there's a lot to be unpacked in terms of how one can do it, but that's, I think, the biggest issue, to do it in parallel.
You mentioned another topic, supply chains, also obviously very important. Francesco, I know that the question is difficult and it's very hard to pick one thing, but what do you say, the one challenge that you say would need to be addressed the most urgently?
Thanks. I take the opportunity to also refer to the debate that we had before. I mean, small scale farmers are already feeding the world in terms IFAD has calculated some time ago, and there was largely communicated that 80% of food production in the so-called global south. I don't like that term.
80%.
80%. Then there has been a debate, and I think that they FAO, and that there has been some letter that has bin published later, but that figure is 74%, but of the global food consumption. So it might even be higher. Anyway, whatever the figure is, it is what we know is that small scale farmers are already feeding the world. In Europe, that might not be the case. Of course, we don't have that perception, but in Africa, as the biggest part of Asia and Southeast Asia and Latin America, that's already the case. The one challenge, I mean, from my perspective, because I'm a specialist on agroecology and sustainable agriculture, is definitely how do we switch towards more sustainable ways of productions, and how do we kind of build that kind of support also the political level. I think that so the agroecology techniques and in general natural farming and nature-based solutions, whatever we want, organic farming, whatever we want to call them, have done lots of progresses in recent years. There is now an increasing also interest of governments in investing, even in India. Actually, I was reading this morning to have a little bit more information about the context. Initially, the zero budget natural farming was even supported by the current prime minister, and so it has quite a large political support. But then a debate kind of spark and the so-called socio-technical regime, so the business as usual kind of interest have kind of lowered that political endorsement. So there is, I think, what is key to solve is that kind of polarizing debate between agroecology, small scale farmers, and larger scale industrial operations. There is a large spectrum of, I mean, farming and farmers pertain to a large spectrum of different types of activities, and every one of them can tend towards better practices. And I think this is important, and there's also been a mistake, let's say, of the agroecological movement in terms more of civil society, that is to polarize that debate. So I think what we need to reconcile is that kind of also proving that agroecology can be a very profitable economic business, and that should be the way forward, as it should be also for the ecological transition. It is an opportunity and not, let's say, a constraint.
Good, excellent. Thank you very much, Francesco. Roberto, what would be your one issue that you would like to point out to here?
I think in my case, the main point to arise is that there is always trade-offs in terms of this climate resilience. So even the concept of climate smart agriculture involves different trade-offs between higher production, adaptation. By the way, GHG means greenhouse gases.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that. Yeah.
So reduction of greenhouse emissions, for instance, or adapting to climate change. And when we do climate smart agriculture interventions, we always need to be aware of these trade-offs, so we can maybe mitigate better in some regions, or maybe have better adaptation or more productivity. Ideally, it's always good to have these three pillars in mind, but it's not always possible. And I think that's the main challenge when we talk about the real resilience.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, nothing, in life is free, and you cannot often achieve all the goals that you have at the same time. That is true. Shilanjani, finally over to you. What would be your one thing that you're passionate about, that you believe is crucially important when it comes to successfully establishing climate resilient food systems?
I think something that continues to be a challenge is participatory decision making. Is bringing in local voices, local knowledge, and translating that or combining that with interventions or technical support that comes from the beyond. A lot of times policies or interventions are made not keeping in mind local contexts or in very technical, practical ways of how the crop is grown, which leads to policy failures. So I think it is important to also keep in mind this facet, as well as also adding on to what Nandini said about diversification. We must remember that certain crops like millets also grow with other crops. So the decline of millets has also caused the decline of other crops, such as pigeon peas, which are intercropped or grown together. So perhaps this is an opportunity to think about diversification of these crops, and to combine local knowledge systems with also other expert forms of knowledges and skills and interventions. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We've already come to the end of this webinar. As we've seen, things are complex. That's often the case, but also here, but also, of course, fundamentally important. So I would like to thank all of my panelists very much for this engaging and very, very interesting discussion, and of course encourage you to work hard on these topics in research and in practice, because they are obviously fundamentally important to all of us if we want to be able to feed a still growing global population under the adverse conditions of climate change. Thank you also very much to our audience for asking questions, for participating in our polls. As I mentioned before, this is a monthly format, so I look forward to seeing you all to the topic that we're going to address in a month's time. Until then, thank you very much and have a great day.